You did it back there? Yeah, okay, good.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight, and whoever's out there on Zoom as well. As Carol said, I'm Michael McCarthy. I am was a longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I worked 22 years for that newspaper in Chicago, in New York, and in Atlanta. And in the past about 15 years, I've been an author. So Ashes Underwater is my second book. I just published one about 2-3 years ago on the Hindenburg disaster, remember? So I'm getting a little bit of a disaster thing going here. Makes me really cheery at parties and everything. But I think as I describe the book tonight, talk about it, you may understand a little bit why I'm drawn to this kind of story. But I will say I'm working on a new book that I can't talk a lot about, but it is not a disaster. So, so I'm growing. So when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, I had been there for about a decade in Chicago, when someone mentioned to me at a restaurant one night on the river, the Chicago River, that a big steamship had turned over in that river, and that more passengers died in that accident than on the Titanic. And I thought, how could that possibly be true? The Chicago River is about as wide as this room through most spots. And a big steamship flipped over, and still, as close as people were in the city, they couldn't get to everybody. So I got very intrigued with how that happened and why it hadn't been written about, why no one seemed to remember it. And what I discovered is that there actually was some malfeasance. There was some criminal wrongdoing. That shouldn't be surprising when a giant steamship, almost as the length of a football field, which is still tied to its dock with lines fatter than my arms, tipped over nonetheless. You understand? It's tied to the dock. It's not out in open water where it like hit an iceberg or something. So somebody did something wrong. And with my training and work at the Wall Street Journal, I figured that there was a way to get at that. So one of the first things I did.
I'm just here to check.
All right, that's fine. One of the first things I did was I went to the National Archives Great Lakes office in Chicago, sort of South Side. And I just decided I wanted to find out what the historical record looked like. That's where most of the records on the Eastland disaster are located. They have something like 12 boxes. Each one is about this big, thousands of pages of letters, reports, photographs, testimony from various inquests and investigations. And I actually started, believe it or not, in 1999 on researching this book. It took me about 10 years. 10 years is way too long. That is not what I would recommend. It wasn't that I was slow. I was methodical. I also was raising kids. I had the Wall Street Journal job and so forth. But there's a lot of work to be done. And one of the things that I discovered, I want to talk about, because what really drove me to write the book was that there really was some criminal responsibility that had never been acknowledged before. So let me briefly kind of review what we have here. This is, here's our ship. This is the Eastland, right? This is in 1904, and it's in its home port, its original port of South Haven, Michigan. South Haven, Michigan is on the shoreline almost directly across from Chicago, which is not accidental that the Eastland would be here, because it was originally built by a couple of retired captains in the early 1900s, 1902, 1903, so that they could run passengers between South Haven, the tourist town, and Chicago, right? And it was $1 a ticket each way, or a round trip, sorry. And so they had this ship designed to run tourists back and forth. Here it is again in South Haven. I love this picture. Look at the women with their, ankle length dresses and their hats. To go on a steamship at this time was one of the most opulent experiences anyone could have. We barely have photographs now. We do not have radio. So to the extent people saw rich people, there were photographs of them with these big steamer tanks, right? And their fine gowns and their suits and everything getting onto a steamship. So for poor people who didn't have much by way of means, to get on a steamship was like getting on, the Concorde or something today, some incredible experience that only the rich and famous get to do. But here for $1, they could have the same experience of quite wealthy people. I like this shot too, because it gives you an idea of the kind of what people were wearing at the time. Everyone's really well dressed. You see this? This is a big deal to go out on these ships. I love the little girl in the center. If you see her big bow. The captain is on the edge here, looking out, and this is in Ohio, this particular shot. Here is the Eastland off in the distance. It's the one far away from us, and in close is its competitor, which was the city of South Haven. The Eastland was built so that it could race literally the city of South Haven out on the lake. Now, the inspectors hated this. It's very dangerous. Even today, we don't really race power boats, but this is what they were doing. Okay, so on the day the Eastland sank in Chicago, July 24th, 1915, this is the actual card that the inspectors had. This isn't, like a photocopy of it. This is at the National Archives, what I found. And they were allowed 2,500 passengers, and at 7:30 a.m. they had exactly 2,500 passengers. Okay, we'll talk about occupancy in a minute. This is the moment. This is several moments after the ship has flipped. I need to make this really clear to you because the behavior of the ship when it sank is incredibly important. It's exactly what the defense and the prosecution would fight over when the case actually made it the next year into a federal courtroom. What the ship did, imagine if this is the Eastland. It's sitting at its dock, okay? This is the dock, and here's the Eastland. The Eastland begins to tip this way, right? And for about 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute, and then they straighten it up. Then it begins to tip away from the dock. They straighten it up again. It begins to tip away from the dock again, and then it goes completely over. So there's this strange seesawing that the ship is doing. And what we have here is, and it's a little hard to even see what's happening, but so let me orient you. We are looking at the back, the stern end of the Eastland. You can see the man standing on the propeller here. And we're looking at the starboard, the right side, as you're looking at the ship. All those people were on the Eastland when it sank. But because, remember I told you, it tipped away from the dock, right? Because if you were on the starboard side, all you had to do is step over onto the top and it was completely dry. So many of these people never even got wet. The unfortunate people were on the port side, the left side. Because what happened was as the ship tipped into the water, it quickly filled up. And you have to, it's hard for us to even imagine. How many people saw the movie Titanic years ago so we've all seen it, right? Great movie. The interior of the Eastland looked very similar. Now, it wasn't as opulent, but there was the same beautiful grand staircase. There were cabins. There were, there's a dancing floor. There were bars that had drinks and they were cooking hamburgers. And I mean, it was this beautiful sort of fun atmosphere as large as this room and just kept going. So when it tips, a lot of people were trapped inside. They couldn't get out because if you think, again, remember that scene in the Titanic where they go up that staircase, right? The Eastland had the same thing. The only way to get from the top of the ship to the bottom was on one particular staircase. And when the ship flips, now the stairs, instead of the treads going like this, are going like this. there's no way to get up them. And as people grab and try and climb up the stairs, they're sliding down. And of course, everyone's trying to get out at the same time. So the drowning is happening very, very quickly and very, very sadly. Another shot, again, the rear of the ship. This is all these ships. I mean, remember I told you, that's the other side of the Chicago River where that building is. And we're pretty much standing, I mean, where this edge of the photo is pretty much the other dock, right? So this is the whole scene. It's really tight. And all these ships were in the vicinity, but because it flipped so quickly and because people were trapped in the staircase and couldn't get out, 844 people still drowned. Some of the saddest photos for me were the little children who perished in the accident. This is a fireman holding a dead child. They tried to remove children as quickly as they could. They couldn't get to all of them fast enough, and many, many, many perished. This is the Eastland at night on its side. And remember, I said it flipped away from the dock. I don't know if you can see Water Street, Wholesale, the signage there. So people were boarding on that side. They got on, and when they were all set to go, the ship had begun doing this tipping, and it finally, went over. What's interesting is that many of the people on the ship had never traveled on any kind of boat. So when it began tipping, they started making games of it. They thought it was fun. Like, oh my gosh, look at that slide, and they were literally sliding down this deck and making play of it because the crew didn't seem concerned. And so they weren't getting any signals. No one was really understanding the urgency of the situation. One of the things I love about this photo is, in addition to it being at night, those are all headlamps, lights that searchlights and so forth that had up there. And if you look carefully, look at it this way, you can see people at the top. Those are policemen and so forth. Like just above where you see the chairs and the barrels, there are people up there and they look like ghosts, which is really chilling in Shipwreck right after the fact. The other thing that I would point out about this is that the ship is exactly 38 feet across, so what we call beam for ships, 38 feet. At the point it sank in the Chicago River, it is exactly 19 feet deep. So when it turned, it landed and it was completely bisected exactly at the center. At the front, what you see here is, it says around that little cabin, east, and then land is under the water. So EAST is above the water, LAND, the exact middle of the ship is underwater. Now, in a sense, the fact that it sank where it did was good because, number one, they were able to save more people. And secondly, the water was only 19 feet deep, so it stopped at a certain point. Had this been out on the Great Lakes, it would have gone all the way to the bottom, right? So we had some fortune, not much. It's a huge story around the country. Remember, in 1915, we don't even have photographs in newspapers yet, but here's the New York Times the next day. And, more than a half of the front page is devoted to it. Every newspaper in the country was like this. San Diego, San Francisco, Pennsylvania. It was the biggest story all around the country most of the summer. This was an effort to raise it after the fact, after it's filled up with water. They came back about a month later. And this is actually the one that we use on the cover of the book. Interestingly, when they did two interesting things with the cover of the book. One, despite the fact that this is appears to be in reverse in the writing, and it in fact is in reverse in the writing, the image is correct. The ship did tip this way away from the dock. And when they first put the cover together and sent it to me, it had the ship going the wrong way. And I'm like, no, that's not how it felt. And secondly, I don't think that the artist thought it was interesting enough to have just kind of steam and things coming out of it. So if somebody crafted all these fires and, like flames and everything, I'm like, no. Flames have to go. That didn't happen either. So I told you, this is the staircase I was just referring to. And this is from the Chicago Tribune about 2 weeks after when the ship had been raised. They went back and looked at the staircase, and it was horrifying that. So this is what it looks like when it's horizontal. And now when the ship flips, there's no way to get out. In fact, they found dozens and dozens of people all crammed together right at that choke point. Again, this is one of the children who survived, all kinds of stories. This is all in the book, but I'm going to move a little bit quickly through some of this because we need to get to who did what and why. This is a little boy who went missing for a long time. You know, so many people died so quickly that they were pulling bodies out. They couldn't save most of them, and they had to lay them out onto floor of a warehouse, which was across. We had a photo of it earlier, actually, up there, and relatives would come and identify them. And for a while, this little boy, Billy Novotny, no one had come and identified him, and all of Chicago was heartbroken that this child had been left. And it was because most of his family was killed on the ship too, and he had survived. And he had not survived, so no one was there to claim him. Okay, now we need to get to a couple characters who are important. I told you that I went to the National Archives, and while I was there, I was completely overwhelmed by how much material there was. There were so many boxes. There was thousands of pages. I didn't even know where to start. I started looking through some things, and I was overwhelmed. So I went to one. It was called Exhibits, and I just started flipping through that because there's some photographs, you know, a little bit easier material to work through. And while I'm looking through there, and this is important to understand, it's really early in my research. I've only been at it for a day or two, and this never happens. While I'm there, flipping through, I find a 15-page typewritten document. Everything was on typewriters back then, right? And in this document, I start reading it. It's one of the few documents in Exhibits. Most of the other text is in other boxes. But this thing is, as I'm reading it, it appears to be an interview between the chief of police of the city of Chicago and this man here, Joseph Erickson. Joseph Erickson was what I discovered, he was a huge hero in this story. And I came to really admire him in part because the ship owners tried to blame him for the accident to save themselves. And when he was sort of cast aside and had to come up with his own legal representation, that's when an attorney who would become much more famous later in life stepped in, and that was Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow we're in 1915 at this point. It's about 10 years out. He will become by far the most decorated, well-known celebrity attorney in the entire country. But at this point, he's not really that well known. So let's connect these people. Let's talk about how this happened. I mentioned before that I'm looking through the National Archives and I see this interview, this interrogation really is what it was, between Joseph Erickson, who is the chief engineer on the ship, on the Eastland. Now let me explain very briefly how the ranking works. The top two officers on the ship, number one is the captain, who's in charge of all operations. Anytime the boat moves, he's in charge. And then this guy here, the chief engineer, is in charge of all machinery, right? So they work together, they coordinate. The captain will tell him what bearing, what speed he needs, slow down, tip the boat a little bit this way. He's giving all the instructions, but all the machinery comes under his power. Second most powerful person on the ship. So he's interrogated by the chief of police the day after, is at noon in the Chicago Police Department, and they start talking about what happened, right? And Captain Healy, who's the police chief, is a very skilled interrogator. He actually came up through the mounted police, which it's funny. In 1915, it's amazing to me how many things haven't happened. I mentioned newspapers don't have photographs. There's no radio. At the time, the rules of the road in Chicago were for both cars and horses. So your operating signal for when you were going to turn left was a hand outside the car or your horsewhip. both were simultaneous. The roads were both, sort of horse cart and increasingly cars. So Chief Healy, who was a mounted policeman, starts interviewing Erickson. He has a sense that, all good interviewers have a intuition. And he said, he's going to tell me something. I know it. So they only spent about 2 hours, and the entire transcript of the interview is right there. And in it, I read something that just floored me. It said that what Joseph Erickson told the chief of police the day after that ship tipped over, mysteriously, suspiciously, that he had had a conversation with one of the ship owners 2 months earlier, before the season began. And the ship owner said, I wonder if we might change the machinery a little bit to stabilize the boat better. And so Erickson said, well, what do you have in mind? He said, well, and I'll explain this in a second, but just for our purposes, that he wanted to be able to move the water in certain tanks quicker so that they could stabilize the boat better. And Erickson's response was, he's brand new to the company, by the way. Erickson says, well, we could do it, but it'd be very expensive. And we'd have to have the boat out of the water. I mean, you literally have to be what they call dry dock to make these repairs. And so the owner of the company says, let's wait till after this season. So he didn't want to jeopardize ticket revenue before the season started. Now, a couple things are interesting here. Erickson was a very skilled engineer. He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. He'd been on ships for 10 years. He was a Norwegian immigrant to the US. Most of the Marine people are from Norway. It's huge contingents of people who are immigrants. He was licensed by the federal government, very strict licensing standards. He's a real top-notch person. So when the police say, what happened? And he said, well, we did have this discussion. What Erickson didn't know is that there were several severe mishaps with the ship that the owners knew about. It nearly capsized twice before. And it had some kind of mishap outside Chicago in 1914, the season before Erickson showed up, which they didn't tell him about, and caused one of I showed you the man standing on the propeller. That propeller is actually 10 inches thick, the shaft of it. It split, it broke. How much force it would take to break a propeller that's 10 inches in diameter of steel is astonishing to me. What's clear is that the ship was not under control. They were not able to control the ship. It was a little bit of a bucking bronco, and they knew, but they didn't tell him. So when he told the police that they had this discussion, they cut him off. They said, fine, you find your own representation. The owners of the company and the captain got their own attorneys. They had, their money well-heeled. They were able to get their own good representation. And Erickson, they said, good luck, you're on your own. So they literally, none of them are jailed, but he is. He's the good guy, right? So this, to me, I'm saying this is a great story that really deserves to be told in a book. Now, it's not like I'm, speculating that this is what happened. This is exactly what the prosecutors found. What they did was they interviewed Erickson and they looked through records, and they could tell that the machinery in the Eastland was deeply flawed. Now, I'm not going to get too in the weeds here, but I'm going to get a little technical. There's a concept called ballast on a boat. It's basically weight. It's some sort of weight. It's often used to stabilize a ship. It's usually in the bottom, in the hull, and it helps weigh the ship down so that, I'm tall, a shorter person closer to the ground is more stable than I am, so I'm more likely to tip. So if you add enough ballast, you can actually stabilize, make the ship more balanced, right? That's what the typical purpose of ballast is. there's two kinds. There's something called fixed ballast, which is often iron. So there's tons of iron that are just dropped in the bottom of the hull, and it just drops it down, makes it sink further in the water and be more stable. There's also something called liquid ballast, which is what the Eastland used. Liquid ballast means that it's the same idea, more weight, but rather than it being fixed weight, like some kind of iron bars or something, it was water. So what the Eastland would do was the Eastland had one inlet called a seacock, where they would unscrew it and literally the water would gush in from the lake or from wherever was in the river, whatever body of water was in. The seacock was below the water line. So once you open a hole in a ship, it's going to fill up. What they're effectively doing is partial sinkings. And this all works great if you bring the water directly into the tank you want or pump it to the other one you want. And so it sounds kind of crazy, but let me explain why do we do this? So if I'm the Eastland, again, using the book, maybe this is my dock, right? And we show up, we pull up to the dock, and the ship is a little higher than the dock, and people need to walk up into those gangways, right, to get in. So the captain says, hey, why don't you just tilt, level it out and tilt it a little bit more toward the dock. So what they would do is admit water into the tanks, and by focusing the water in these tanks, it would tilt it down just a little bit, and they'd be able to have that walkway be very level so that no one falls off or so forth. Likewise, there are locks. There's different times when you might want the ship to have different, elevations. In its home port of South Haven, there was a sandbar right at the mouth of that lighthouse. Remember, we saw the picture where the two of them go out, right about 30 feet out in front of that, in front of those piers was a bar of sand under the water, which piled up all the time. It had to be dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers. But these ships were so heavy and large that they would often get stuck, and they get stuck in the sand. So what they would do is they would pump out the ballast, the water in these tanks, right? Pump it out so the ship would weigh less. It would go higher up in the water, get over the sandbar, and then they let the water back in. Okay, all works fine so long as the movement of water inside the ship is controlled. What the prosecutors discovered, though, was that the piping and the single outlet, the single inlet for water to come in, weren't enough to move it very quickly. So what would happen is, and I like to think of it like if you ever carry a tray of water, maybe like a cookie tin or something, or a lasagna tray, and you're carrying it, and all of a sudden the water starts to go one way and you're trying to adjust for it, right? And it's kind of going back and forth. This is what's happening inside the Eastland. This is what was happening inside the Eastland the morning of the accident. They were trying to adjust levels, and no sooner did they get it one way than the ship was pulling the other way. And so it was this fight inside the ship. Now, this has not been divulged in any previous book before I wrote mine. I read several books on it. It wasn't out there. And there's a few reasons why, which we'll get to, which is why the aftermath, which is what we're going to focus on tonight, why it was important for me to go to the actual trial to figure out the story. You know what I'm saying? I was only able through all of the testimony and cross-examination to figure out what happened to the boat. And we'll also talk about why, despite the fact Clarence Darrow was a wonderful attorney and working for Joseph Erickson, who was completely innocent, the way the charges were constructed ruined the case. It basically allowed for misjustice to happen. We'll talk about that in 1 second. Okay, so we have this real problem. If you're Clarence Darrow, my client has told the police that there was a conversation about fixing the boat and they decided not to. That sure sounds like they cut corners and people died. That's a really tough hurdle to get over. So why would Darrow do it? Well, let's talk a little bit about who Clarence Darrow was and where he was at this point in his career. Clarence Darrow was I'm sure because I saw the hands in the recognition. Many people know of his career and how big he was, but he wasn't always that big. And he wasn't always that much of a celebrity. And right at the moment when the Eastland happened, he was in a really rare valley in his career. He had really hit bottom. What happened was Clarence Darrow, well-known Chicago attorney, but not really a national figure, just well-known in Chicago circles, went out to Los Angeles, where he was representing some union people who were involved in unions back then were quite violent, and they blew up the offices of a newspaper because they didn't like what the management was doing. That was their way of protesting. Well, some people died and there was a lot of property damage, so they went on trial. They asked Clarence Darrow to represent them. Now, Darrow has always been a champion of the underdog. He always likes, if you've got big company and, endangered employees, exploited and underpaid, he's always going to take the employees to represent. And that's what he did here. The problem is he was losing the case. And so he decided to bribe one of the jurors. He bribed one of the jurors out in Los Angeles. He was caught. It went to trial. Ultimately, he was exonerated, but there's no historian that's looked at the record that thinks for 1 second that he didn't do it and just got away with it. So he comes back to Chicago, pretty much disgraced. His career's over. He thought about quitting. He thought about teaching. He thought about taking up music. I mean, he was like, laws, I'm done. I'm washed up. When Joseph Erickson shows up and says, I'm in trouble. And my company has cut me away. So this is right down the center of the plate for what Darrow likes. Here's an underdog. I've got, malfeasance by corporate greed. I mean, he loves this. And he says, I can use this case. I know it's going to be sensational. And I know it's going to be in the newspapers. I can rehabilitate my career and, have the spotlight back on me again. So this is where he's coming in. Meantime, I told you that that Erickson was fairly poor, Norwegian immigrant. He's married. His wife is pregnant. His wife is pregnant. He's in prison. Would have been their first child. He's distraught and has, no way out, no money to pay for a lawyer. So all of his union buddies start pitching in money into a legal fund, and they collect $1,000. $1,000 was a lot of money back then, and they gave that to Darrow as his retainer to start. So Darrow now has money. He's got a big case, and Erickson, has the possibility of, being freed, right? Not going to jail for this thing that he didn't do. He was on a bad ship. He was on the worst ship in America, and he didn't know it. When this happened, I think it was only his 15th trip on the Eastland. He'd had 10 years on a whole bunch of other ships. The Eastland hadn't acted up for him before, but the owners knew that there was a history. They knew what the problems were. He was so good, he was able to actually compensate for it, but this morning he couldn't. So what happens? There are 5 separate investigations in Chicago right after it sinks. People are out for blood. They know, everyone in Chicago knows someone who either died on the ship or was a relative of someone. Everyone, thousands and thousands of Chicagoans are touched by this. On top of all the coverage in the newspapers, everybody was angry, and they wanted to, get to the bottom of it. 5 separate investigations, and importantly, there was a state one and there was a federal one. And they couldn't try them both at once, so they had to come together and decide which are we going to do first. They decided to let the federal government, the U.S. government, the U.S. attorney prosecute the case. So the federal goes first. Now the problem is, and I'm not going to make this complicated, but it's an important point. There are several ways that when you do something wrong, you can pick different laws to say this is the law you broke for the same action, right? Same action. it might be that if I try you for one particular charge, it's easier to find you guilty for what you did. But if I try another one, it'll be harder, even the same behavior, right? This is exactly what happened. The federal prosecutors decided, let's do two different counts. We're going to say that the owners, who I've told you before were bad and they knew it, and the captain and the chief engineer, 1 and 2 on the ship, and the inspectors, 6 individual men, all conspired together to make this happen. And that's a really hard case to make. It's a really hard case to make, but there is a law on the books in federal maritime and US law that said it is illegal to conspire to bring a ship to sea that is unsafe. And so the federal prosecutor said, this is the law that we're going to get him on. And the other one was related conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. Okay, so now they've got here are two different things that you did. When that ship sank, you broke both these laws. As I'll demonstrate in just a couple minutes, the choice of that charge was exactly how the men got away with the whole thing. And it's complicated by the fact that, not complicated, hard to understand, it is aggravated by the fact that Darrow, in representing just one of the 6 men, ultimately had to represent all of them. In other words, if he gets his client off, he gets everybody off. They're all in the same boat, so to speak. Okay, so the final third of the book, Ashes Underwater, is all about the criminal trial. And that's what almost no book has written about before. And I found it really fascinating. And some readers have told me over the years, oh my God, the trial was my favorite part. And some have said, I really kind of got bogged down in the trial. So, you know, it's hard to know. For me, I think it was really intriguing. And I really tried to keep it alive. There are several wonderful scenes. At one point, the captain stands up on the stand and is in tears and shouting that he did everything he could. There were 2 different models. They made little Eastland models, and they put them in tanks and floated them and tried to show, well, our theory is what happened. No, our theory is what happened. So I mean, we have these like little toy boats in the court, and they argued over technically whether the Chicago River exists anymore. They argued over jurisdiction. You know, was it international water? Was the city of Chicago responsible? But I want to talk about the role that Darrow had, because it was the most interesting. You know, I spent, as I mentioned, 10 years researching this book, and I thought that Darrow, because he won the case, basically, would have written about it, would have said, this is one of my most famous cases. I really did great work. He never did. He never did. He never said a word about the case. Do you want to know how much I know he never said a word about it? I went out to the National Archives in Washington, and they have all Clarence Darrow's files for his autobiography. He wrote Story of My Life or something like that, I believe is the name. And hundreds of pages. And they have, I read the published autobiography, but here's the manuscript, his own typewriting with his own revisions. He scratched stuff out, he's put it in. So I'm flipping through and going, oh, he probably mentioned it and took it out later. And I get to 1914, I get to 1915. There's nothing there. He never talked about this case. It was a big one. It rehabilitated him. So I got really curious about that. And what I don't like to speculate. I really don't, but I think I have enough information that I can do it with a certain amount of authority and informed. I think Darrow was ashamed. I think he was ashamed. He did get his client off, but as I mentioned, because it was a conspiracy where everybody had to be guilty or everybody had to be innocent, by getting the innocent guy off, he also got the people who were really guilty. And Darrow knew that hundreds of people, women and children, died. And through his work, and it was very good legal work, I will say that, he ended up, the guilty were discharged as well as the innocent. But let me tell you a couple things that he did, because he was a masterful attorney. and a really deceptive man, to be honest, really, really deceptive. Darrow had he was a wonderful criminal trial attorney. He's great at trials. He could really work a jury. He knew how to shamble and drawl and you know, if the prosecution was making a great point, he'd cough and try and distract the jury. And one of the things, remember we talked about the fact that the ballast equipment in the Eastland was kind of haywire, made the ship react like a cookie tray, that the water's just shifting back and forth too quickly. Darrow knew this. Darrow knew this because Darrow saw the same 15-page typewritten interrogation notes that I did. I literally held in my hands the exact same one that Clarence Darrow was his exhibit, actually. How do I know this? Several ways. One of the ways I know is that whenever he entered something into evidence, he would do CSD, Clarence S. Darrow, and circle it at the bottom. And I knew his handwriting. But I also know that where Joseph Erickson told the police chief that the owners had talked to them about the need for repairs, Darrow wrote 2 words in the margin in his own handwriting. Said owners knew. Owners knew. So Darrow has the problem of he knows his guy's innocent, but I've got this case where if my guy goes down, everybody goes down. I've got to save everybody, but I know that they were wrong. I know that they knew. So he has to figure out how to hide this. And Clarence Darrow does what he typically did in cases back then, which was if he knew that there was a real and plausible and probably true reason for something to happen, he'd make something else up. And that's what he did here. Remember, I played with the book and I showed you how the Eastland seesaw, right? It tipped, and I said, this is gonna be important because we're gonna talk about it. This was the behavior that became the crux of this legal case. The federal government says these 6 men, the ship officers, 2 top ship officers, the inspectors, and the owners. These 6 men all knew this ship was unsafe, and they sent it out anyway, right? In order for Clarence Darrow to get them off, he has to explain why the ship did this. That sure looks like a bad ship to me, right? I mean, so he has to explain this away. It wasn't poorly operated by the crew because that's his client. And it wasn't a bad ship because if they get in trouble for that, his client goes down as well. So he decides to make up a theory that the ship, the reason it went back and forth and tipped is because it was on something under the water. They thought it was a piling, what they call a piling. It's a long column. It's like a telephone pole, basically, stuck in the water. Sometimes they were left after a particular job. And he says, well, the Eastland got on top of that, and that's why it was flipping back and forth. That's not my client's problem. That's not their fault. It was an unsafe dock, was his theory. And he even had divers go down and saw these things off and carry them into the court. So they carried these big timbers and set them down. And but later testimony shows that the spot where Darrow said they cut those pilings off, which should have been underneath the Eastland, wasn't there at all. There were ships that were parked in the exact same spot, the exact same dock as the Eastland, that sank much lower and would certainly have hit these things. So basically, Darrow had these things cut off from who knows where and said they were under the ship. But that's not the only one, because when that failed, they had a marine diver on the stand, and they said, we found some cement blocks that were under there. These large, I mean, as big as this podium, right? And lots of them. And they hauled it up and they brought it into the court, and they said to the diver, you know, what do you make of this? And he goes, how long were those supposed to have been there? And they go, no telling, but it was long enough for the Eastland to get stuck on them, you know, to the bottom of the ship to hit and tip over. And he said, well, for concrete to have been down there that long, it would have been really slimy with muck and mud. These are clean. And basically what the diver was saying was, and it was clear to the judges that whoever put those in there was probably Darrow and his team. They dropped concrete under there and said, no, it was this. If it wasn't the piling, the columns, and then it was this concrete. So everything is failing. Everything is failing. Darrow, the prosecution brought a wonderful maritime expert, a marine professor of marine architecture, probably the finest mind on marine construction in the country, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, genius really in this area. And they interview him and they say, you know, on the stand, they've got all these questions. And he basically says it was an unsafe ship. It, given the amount of coal where the passengers were, it was too top heavy. It was going to flip over, this sort of thing. And Darrow listens, and he's getting more and more impatient because he's realizing this testimony is very, very bad for his client and for the larger group he's trying to absolve. And he goes up to the professor and he says, I'm just curious, how many tons of coal did you estimate were in the Eastland when this happened? And he said 50 tons. He said 50. In fact, it was more than 100. And the professor estimated where the passengers were. Remember I told you they were around the staircase? Staircase is the middle of the ship. He thought they were all in the bottom of the ship. They weren't. They weren't in the bottom. So he's got most of the passengers in the wrong place. He's got the coal wrong. Basically, all that testimony that the prosecution brought together on why it was an unsafe ship was torn apart by Darrow because he was able to show that the professor had made some key errors in his calculations, right? So at the end of the day, the judge finds that they were not criminally responsible under the laws. Now, one thing I haven't brought up is, this is a technicality. Right now in this country, if I do something in the state of Illinois and I commit a crime here and run across to Michigan and go, you know, I'm fine, you can't arrest me, I'm in Michigan now, right? They will grab me, arrest me, and bring me back, right? But in 1915, the laws between the states they were a little murkier. And I remember I told you there were 6 men. 5 of the 6 defendants lived in the state of Michigan. There's only one, who we'll talk about in just a second, who lived in Illinois. When the charges were brought by the federal government, the 5 men who lived in Michigan said, we're not going to go back to Chicago. You know, everybody hates us there. We'll never get a fair trial. We simply won't go. This triggered a proceeding called a removal proceeding. You know what the sense of extradition is? Like, you've done something wrong in France and the United States has an extradition treaty. You can't just, you know, kill somebody in France and run to America. We're going to send you back, you know, that sort of thing. Didn't precisely exist state to state at this time. So if you did have 5 people who you were criminally charging who lived in Michigan and you wanted to bring them back to Illinois to court to answer the charges, there was a protection for those defendants, and that's what they took advantage of. There's something called a removal proceeding. What that means is that the prosecution must go before a federal judge, which they did, and present a case as to why we believe they're guilty, and you need to send them back. You must order them back to the Chicago court. That's what this entire trial that I wrote about was. It was just trying to force them to go back to Chicago. When they failed to do so, when Darrow basically outwitted them, none of the 5 men who lived in Michigan ever had to go back to Chicago. They weren't forced to go back, which meant that there was no way for the Illinois prosecutors to get at them. Now, I just want to add one other thing. The state, remember I mentioned that the federal government decided to go with conspiracy. The state had 2 stronger and more promising charges. One was manslaughter, and the other was criminal negligence. Those sound really good, don't they? I mean, those are the kinds of charges that they could have gotten them on. But because they went with the federal charges of conspiracy, which were hard to prove and really difficult to even construct, they failed. They let them slip away. The prosecutors in Illinois vowed that if any of those men showed up on soil in Illinois, they would arrest them and try them. But in reality, that wasn't going to happen. And here's why. Once they spent 2 weeks in federal court with, I mean, there were thousands of pages of testimony. There were 100 witnesses. There were photographs. They've been over everything. There's no way they were going to start that all over again. And it's a sense of double jeopardy, right? They've already been tried for this. We're not going to get them on this. So basically, all of the Eastland men, all the Eastland defendants got away with it. You know, you saw those children. That's not okay. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I felt that there are different ways to have justice. One is you could have criminally found that they were responsible way back then. They could have gone to jail, done their time, you know, been remorseful, whatever. That's one resolution. But absent that, the other way we can have justice is by a full airing of what actually happened. And by pointing the fingers at who did what wrong and why they escaped the grip of justice, which is what the book is about. That's why I spent so long on it. It took a long time to figure all that out. And I told you that Darrow never wrote about the case. I believe I've made that clear, haven't I? Never wrote about the case, but I spent most of the 10 years when I was researching the book trying to find his family, Erickson's family. You know, when you narrate a story, you really want to humanize it. You know, you don't want cartoon characters. You want people who have real feelings, personalities, emotions, disappointments, all these things. I wanted that for him. This is a very hard character to work with. He was poor. He'd never wrote a memoir like Darrow did. And I just felt like if I could find some of his family, maybe there's some letters, maybe there's some photos, something that would humanize him. Well, it took a long time, but I did. Now, this is before the internet, or, you know, the internet's sort of coming on, early 2000s. At one point, I took out newspaper ads in 7 or 8 Michigan towns for relatives of Erickson. Just wrote a little thing, researching a book, trying to find relatives who knew, you know, Joseph Erickson and so forth. And I got 2 letters. One said not related. And then the second letter came in and said, it sounds like a fascinating story, but no, we're not related either. So I'm getting nowhere, but this is one of the few breaks I got with the internet. I will tell you, virtually every word in this book is backed up by some piece of paper somewhere in libraries, in probate courts, in letters, in court testimony. The National Archives, I talked about going down there. There are 1,500 pages to the trial transcript. 1,500. They're all typewritten. Literally, a stenographer sat in the court and afterward, you know, would type it up. When you hold the pages, they're really brittle. If you put your hand under the bottom, as I did, you can feel the imprints of the keys coming through the bottom. These are the original things. The National Archives I absolutely love them. They're such a national treasure. I mean, I've done 2 books that work that I found preserved by the National Archives made it possible to understand something we never did before. And maybe this is a bad story for librarians, but they are very concerned about preservation of documents, which I understand. What that meant was if they determined that they felt it was really brittle, they would limit the number of pages that you could copy per day. So I was limited to 75 pages per day. I have 1,500 pages I need to do. So figure out the math, right? I go the first day, I get my first 75 pages. I bring them, I go the next day, order 75 more. Over 3 or 4 days, I check, they've forgotten some, right? They've accidentally not copied one. So I go in with the next set and I say, you know, I want these 75 and you missed these 2, and I don't want that counted against my first 75. They cost 50 cents a page. That's $750 I paid for this thing. But, you know, and at this point, I don't even have a publisher. I don't even know if it's going to work as a book, but I believe it will. But what I'm trying to say is it's important to really pin things down. You need to go to original sources, what people talked about in court when they were under oath, right? These are the original letters, the things that people wrote 1 or 2 days after, who are eyewitnesses, not 40 years later or 50 years later. So almost every word in here came from one of those documents, some piece of paper that I could find in a library, a repository, an archive, or something. But I was able to find Joseph Erickson's distant granddaughter, I think is what she was. Yeah, because she married into the family. And the way I found it was literally this photo. Now, I've spent 10 years on this book at this point, and I know every photo that exists of this ship and every character. I know, I've seen them all of them. There's hundreds. I've seen every single one. I hadn't seen that one. I'd never seen that one. I was like, who has that? Who has that? I've got everything. And somebody has that. It's a good one, by the way. So I figure out that the granddaughter who married into the family of Joseph Erickson began doing genealogy. And she said, I just learned that this man was on a ship, and unfortunately, you know, many people died. So she felt guilt about that. Like, it's like finding there's a horse trader in your family, right? Or a murderer or something. They went back and she figures out that, you know, this guy's bad, or thinks he is, right? So I reach out to her. I write, you know, to her genealogy thing in a group, and I say, I know who your relative is. I know who that distant relative is. And you're wrong. He was actually a good guy. He was a hero. And if you'll meet with me and talk with me, I can help get that story out, because I'm convinced it's true. Well, she was very nervous. Here's this, you know, I did work for the Wall Street Journal, so there's a little bit of credibility, but she had some other issues, domestic violence and problems. She was scared of men. I said, I'll bring my wife. It was a long back and forth of negotiation. But we eventually, I went out to Portland, Oregon, where she was, and she shows me this photo, and she shows me a series of letters that Joseph, her husband's great-grandfather, I believe, wrote to his wife while he was overseas. He was in World War I as a soldier on ships. While he was in the Great Lakes at the Army Corps of Engineer, all these love letters, little thing, you know, how's the baby, you know, all this sort of thing. And then, and I'll be brief with this, but it's so I can still remember, we're sitting in a Starbucks. That seemed neutral ground. Sitting in a Starbucks, and she's flipping through all these different things, and she lifts up a piece of paper, and I see what I know upside down, and with the type not facing me, is Clarence Darrow stationery. I have seen enough of the man's business correspondence at this point that I looked right at that and I'm like, I'm in a Starbucks with Clarence Darrow, you know? And so I said, could I see that? And I flip it around and I'm like, and remember, I was pretty clear that Darrow never wrote about it. He wrote to Joseph Erickson's widow after the case. I found the only thing that I'm aware of he ever wrote by following up with this woman on a photo and some papers and letters. So that ends up getting in the book as well. Remember I told you that Erickson said he spoke with one of the officers on the ship about repairing. This is him, Walter Steele. I love this photo because this is after the ship is sank. And here he is walking, his nice suit, look at this big chunky ring he has, really rich guy, and he's just walking away from it. Just walking away, and he knows that he postponed the work that could have averted the whole thing. That it maybe never had to happen because of him. Here's our Clarence Darrow, 1915. He was a little like Charlie Chaplin, you know, he wore these suits that didn't quite fit, you know, and he'd slough around. He loved to play with that sort of thing. The last thing I want to show you is, I love this cartoon. This is from one of the Chicago papers. In Chicago, they have a big book day where you can go walk around. They have all kinds of tables and they'll sell old newspapers and books and so forth. Well, I looked and they had a big, you know, I mentioned, if you think the New York Times headline was big, the papers back in Chicago at the time, I mean, the type was this big about the Eastland, right? And this is on the front page. And I love this picture because this is a cartoon that ran on the front page. And it's the hand to blame. They still hadn't gone through the criminal case yet, but they're trying to figure out what happened. And you have this greed, right? And the greed is pulling the thing over. And it's a really graphic depiction. There's so many people and they're spilling into the water. And it's so good in so many ways. However, the ship is being pulled the wrong way. It actually came the other way. So the hand is pulling. So at any rate, the point was well made, I thought, by this cartoon. So that's pretty much my presentation. How are we doing for time? Maybe about 15 minutes of questions, if we have that. Yeah. And then I think this nice lady here said that she started reading it and you were effusive in your praise, so I believe we should yield the floor to her.
The things that just in your talk and they, was it the rifle company that wanted to move the fruit and the produce to get money and to be faster?
Yes, well, they both were. They were both doing the same thing.
Well, but
Yes.
did the passenger part also coincide with that? They transported the fruit and the produce and people, right?
Right. So yes. So the question is, was the Eastland involved with cargo and passengers or just passengers? And the reality is, there was better money in passengers. It was higher paying. So both ships, while they intended to do cargo of fruit, the fruit fields of Michigan, ended up doing passengers. Yeah.
How long did it take to get from Chicago to Southampton?
It's about 3 hours. Yeah.
So how many times did they pass? Just once a day or twice?
So how many times did the two competing ships?
No.
How many trips would they make? They would typically do two. They would typically do two. The morning that the question is, you know, how frequently did the ship run between, it's about a 70-mile course between South Haven, Michigan, the western coastline of Michigan, and Chicago. They would typically do two a day. The morning that the Eastland sank, they were actually headed to Michigan City, which is in Indiana, not Michigan. And most of the people who died on the Eastland were factory employees for the Western Electric Company. Western Electric was a very large employer in Chicago, and they hired a lot of women because they did what's called light manufacturing. Do you remember the old candlestick phones? You know, it looked like a candle and you'd lift up the receiver and you'd hold it like this. That's what they made. Almost every single phone in the entire country came from that one factory in Chicago. Many of them were immigrants. They were paid decently, but they weren't highly paid. And one of the reasons that so many women were employed was because there were over 100 parts to making that nimble telephone. It was easier for them to actually do the delicate finger work to put it together than it was for guys. Guys' hands were too big, and women were better, like almost like seamstress. So it was at a time when few women were working in the workforce at all. This factory actually employed a lot of them. The sad part of that is that that meant that many of the young women and mothers who were on the ship wouldn't have been there except for the fact that, it was a company picnic. An additional sad thing is that the Eastland was one of 5 that they were chartering, the company, Western Electric, for that day. And if you bought a ticket, it wasn't to any particular ship. I don't have an Eastland ticket. I have a ticket to ride some ship. And what they did was the Eastland was the first one to board. And so those who wanted to get over to the picnic grounds in Indiana faster rushed to the Eastland. So those who, once they hit, I showed you that card, once they hit the 25, they'd send the next group to the following ship. Once that filled, they'd go to the next and so forth. The picnic was canceled. No one ever made it. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Then,
Wait, I'm going to go to a couple others if you don't mind. Yeah. You have one?
I was curious, is the structure of the court case the same as it is today with prosecutors going first and then the defense?
It's a really good question. The defense actually began this proceeding first. And I believe the theory is that they wanted to persuade the judge that their clients, that the charges weren't adequate enough for the judge to send them back. And that's why they started. But the defense began, and then they went to the prosecution. So it's a very strange procedure. I don't think this kind of trial even exists in the United States anymore. It's just the way it was at the time. Yeah. Anyway, to read, I had to read books on how they even did this kind of law because it doesn't exist anymore. There's a question over here. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted you to clarify a couple numbers. I noticed in the newspaper report on the headline, it said 1,718 people on the
Yes.
ground. But then earlier you had quoted 844 drowned. So I'm confused.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So the 844 is right. What we were looking at was the next morning's paper, the New York Times, and they had inflated the number based on early reports. They eventually took it down, so, and 844 is the correct number. Absolutely correct, because did you notice in the book I have every time somebody died, they would say gone. And so I printed 844 gones in the book. And we know from the reporting of the city of Chicago and the Red Cross that that they have the 844 by name each person. And so the 1,300 was too much. But yeah, I actually typographically used that gone to give a sense of, I was concerned, like, how do I make a reader feel 844 people, And so, that was when I turned the book proposal into the publisher, I thought if I show all those gones, I send a sample chapter. If I send all those gones, they're gonna think I'm a nut or something, they're not gonna want to publish it. Does key get stuck or something? What is that? So I just did one, and then when I actually accepted and I was under contract, I typed them all up again, put them all in there. And one of my cousins came back and said, I only counted 842. I'm like, count them harder. They're all 844. Cousin, come on now. Carol.
Do you have an idea how all the records ended up at the National Archives since this was an event that happened in Chicago?
So only some of them are in Washington, D.C. The way the National Archives splits things off, they sometimes have regional repositories, and the regional repository for the Great Lakes is in Chicago. So I lucked out with that, particularly given that I had to go back for every 75 pages, over and over and over. But yeah, so that's how it's split up. Yeah. And it still is to this day. Yes, sir.
If I remember right, in one of the books, it said that what 1939, somebody brought before the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Reopened it.
Yes.
By patch.
Right. So, right. And it's dealt with in my book as well. We talked about the fact that there was a federal conspiracy charges. We talked about the fact that state prosecutors in Illinois wanted to bring criminal negligence and manslaughter charges. They ultimately didn't. They dropped them, but they could have proceeded with that. The other legal proceeding took over 20 years. This is what you're referring to. It's very good, very detailed oriented question. Took 20 years. People who survived, people whose relatives were killed on the Eastland, had a claim with the insurance company if they could prove that the company was somehow negligent in making it happen. So the federal judge in Chicago who started the conspiracy charges, his name is fascinating, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. You maybe know him from the baseball commissioner, right? Before he was baseball commissioner, he was a judge, federal judge in Chicago, and worked this case. He allowed for an administrator, an arbitrator basically, to review the claims of survivors of Eastland victims with the hope that if the company could be found complicit or responsible, each of those survivors would have gotten a $10,000 payment. That's a lot of money back in 1915, a lot. And that was a fair settlement. I mean, of course, no amount of money can make up for a lost life, but in absent any kind of criminal responsibility, the next best thing maybe would have been to award some cash from the insurance companies to the people whose relatives died in this accident. And it's so troubling when people are so deceptive over and over. And what happened was, and I'm going to spoil for some of you who haven't read it, Erickson dies early, our hero. He dies early. He has a weak heart, and basically he dies from that. After he dies, that case that you're referring to winds its way through, and the company argues that Erickson was filling the wrong tank. He was filling the one on the port side that forced it to go over. All the testimony at the criminal trial made it very clear he was doing the exact right thing to straighten the ship out. And they said, no, he was filling this up. No one went back and checked the original transcript in Grand Rapids where the trial was, which, by the way, there's only 2 copies of this in the world. One is at the National Archives in Chicago, and one is in my garage. Had they have gone back and looked in my garage or the National Archives, they would have found that that testimony was an error. It was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And I believe you're right. I think it was 1939, some 20 years after, these people had been trying to get some compensation for losing their loved ones on the ship. The Supreme Court declined to take the case and gave no reason for it. They just said, we simply aren't going to review. And that was that. That was the last legal remedy left to anyone connected with the ship. And it never went anywhere. Because of lies, again, by the same company that lied at the federal trial in Grand Rapids. Yes, sir.
Getting back to what we were talking about, you said Judge Landis was hoping that there'd be some compensation.
Yes.
The insurance companies, who did they represent? Was it General Electric? Was it the steamship owner?
Oh no, the
Insurance companies.
the insurance the insurance was on the ship itself. It was on the ship itself. So the asset of the ship would have been used to pay everybody. By the way, the Eastland did live another life after this accident, right? So one of the things I found in the National Archives in Washington is that when the Navy bought the ship, when they took it over, their naval inspectors looked at it and they said, well, this ballast system is a problem. So we're going to shut this off. We're not going to allow any of it to be used anymore. And then they cut like a deck off the top because they didn't need it for as much passenger, you know, they were going to use it for a training ship. They didn't need that much capacity. But what stuns me is that the Navy figured out that the ballast system was wrong too. And once they fixed it, the ship was perfectly fine. And remember, where is he? Sorry. This guy here had the opportunity to do it. He knew what needed to be done and just didn't do it. And as soon as the Navy takes the ship over, they do exactly what he talked to Joseph Erickson about, but didn't do. And the Navy had no problems with it whatsoever.
But then they were able to get in and out of the whole port. 'Cause
Yeah.
of Sam.
Yeah, and interestingly though, everyone in the country knew the word Eastland. That was the name for horror back in 1915 in the 20s. We've forgotten it now. But if you said Eastland, it would be like September 11th or, you know, some disaster. Everyone like Hindenburg, you'd say Eastland, people would have that same association with tragedy. So some of the Navy sailors were afraid to go on the new ship, which they called the Wilmette, by the way, after one of the acquiring admirals, I think, was born in Wilmette, Illinois. So they named it for that. Now I took away from you, but if you have another question.
I'm wondering about the 6 men who were being held responsible.
Mhm.
Did they retrospectively look back at Peru, John Peru, who
Mhm.
was the captain and who
Mhm.
was let go, and were there hard feelings also?
Yeah, good question. Nothing in my research suggested that Peru was ever connected with any of it. So I think he just kind of escaped all of that. Yeah, the prosecution was focused directly on the operating company. And by the way, it's a good question because one of the reasons that the Eastland was allowed to go on for as long as it did, see, I particularly blame the inspection service. The Federal Inspection Service was supposed to be looking over the safety of all these ships. And I don't know whether they were just incompetent or whether they were trying to work hard to promote, you know, there's a tension, you promote commerce so ship companies could do well, or do you kind of watch safety? You're really supposed to do both. We see this with the airline industry now, right? They want to promote commerce, but then, you know, doors fly off. So like, you know, these are tensions that still play out, are still important. Yeah, I think that the inspection service had red flags that they failed to follow up on. At one point, the Eastland was out on Lake Erie, nearly tipped over. People were frightened and running. You know, they were sick, nauseated. They were grabbing life vests. This has happened 1907. You know, 8 years before the Eastland actually sinks. Why didn't that report get back? So what happened was when it was out on Lake Erie, they sold different owners sold it to who became the Eastland owners, these guys. No one knew in Illinois that it nearly tipped over in Lake Erie out in Ohio. So, but the inspector should have said, this is a bad ship. This is a bad ship. We're going to figure out what's wrong with it and we're going to fix it. Or we're not going to let you use it. You know, we're going to pull it from service. They have that power. They didn't use it. Yes.
You were just reading a bunch of many times, but the first time we actually saw the monument.
Oh yeah, I haven't even seen it. Yeah, is it impressive?
Very nice. It's
Okay.
not,
That was a picnic that never was, right?
it was
Yeah.
nice, like from what I know about monuments like that, it's just very nice. And I wonder if Chicago probably has one. Something
They
like
do.
that.
Yes, there is a plaque at the riverfront. The Eastland sank at what is LaSalle, the LaSalle Street Bridge. There wasn't a bridge at LaSalle at that time, so it was the nearest bridge was the Clark Street Bridge, and they do have a plaque there. And in fact, in 2015, they had a ceremony there where they laid flowers in the water and so forth. I was there for that, along with some other authors around that. And I should tell you, one of my favorite moments of researching this book was I got to meet an old woman who was actually on the Eastland the day it sank. She was on it. Her name is Libby Ruby. Her last name is Hruby. I believe she was Czechoslovakian. She was, I think, 100 when I met her in 1999. She was speaking at the Chicago Yacht Club. And I was a reporter. I was working in Chicago, and I was just beginning to research this book. And so I had my son, who was 10, said, come with me to this thing. This old lady who was on the Eastland. He's like, what are you talking about? She was the ship, the thing. Remember how Dad showed you the book? So I get there, and I remember she's wearing this floral dress, and she's really thin, old, almost 100 years old. And at that point, she was no longer lucid. She wasn't really able to express herself very well. So they played a recording that she had done about 20 years earlier, and she, sort of nodded as she told the story. And what happened was, she was with her sister. They were children of one of the Western Electric Company employees. They were there, and the ship tipped over. They were on the starboard side. Remember how I said, depending on which side you're on, that's the side, if you had to be on it, that's the one. And she was pulling herself up, but began to fall. And she said, in this radio interview that they played at the Chicago Yacht Club, she said, somebody pushed me by my butt up. She said, I never saw them, never, have no idea who it was. But I got up, my sister got out, and we were able to walk away. So there's a lot of reasons I love that story and what happened, but I'll tell you the main one. Remember how I talked about all the papers that I've been with, all the letters, the meeting the woman, the photos, and the transcript where I can literally feel the bottom of it. As a writer, what helps me portray a story is the humanity, the actual, the tangible details, the things I can touch, right? I saw an Eastland deck chair once, and at a museum, and I kind of sort of sat on it when I probably shouldn't have. It's a long story, but I consider it more of a dusting I did of the sea, but I really wanted to touch that history. And that was the same with Libby. I really wanted to be in contact with somebody, because I can't tell you why or how it helps, but I know it did. And I remember telling her that I was sorry for the ordeal she had as such a little girl. And she just nodded and smiled. And I don't know, I'm sure it helped me. I can't tell you how, but I felt very fortunate. And I also knew, and I told my son, we need to go over there because I don't know how long she'll be around. And of course, she only lived another year or two. And then she was, I believe, the last person who was on the Eastland who died about 10, 12 years ago. And I hadn't even finished the book yet, so. One more?
Yeah.
Oh, actually, we can maybe do two more. Oh, you had relatives? Tell me.
My maternal great grandmother and her son. Maternal great grandfather and the daughter who was my grandmother. The father and my grandmother survived. The mother and son perished.
Were they Western Electric?
And so my question to you is, you said throughout the nation, Eastland is 9/11. We never spoke of it. As a child, I never knew about the Eastland until I was well into my adult years.
Yeah.
I just didn't talk.
I've heard your account over and over.
Yeah.
It was so horrible.
Yeah.
Families just would not talk about it. Never discussed it. I mentioned when 22 whole families died, 22 entire mom, dad, uncle, like all taken out. As I mentioned before, when I'm in Chicago, whole lines of families were taken out that day. That literally the architecture of family trees changed in a single day. from one accident. I'll tell you one brief thing. When I was in Chicago in 2015 for the centennial of the accident, there was a huge ballroom with hundreds of people there. Many of them, like you, who had relatives or whose relatives either were on the ship, survived, didn't survive, or were some of the salvors, people who were salvaging and so forth, helping firemen. And I think the most touching story was two young women were there from Ireland, and they both had really, strong brogues, strong Irish accents. And they said that they were doing genealogical research, and they discovered that there was a couple aunts that they had who were in America. They were in Ireland, and they never knew about them. They didn't know that they were there. And what puzzled them was that they both died on the same day, July 24th, 1950. And so they're like, how, we had two aunts and they died in the same day. What was that about? And they Googled it. They basically checked the internet and found out there was this terrible accident. And in fact, they were two of the people, and the family had never talked about it. They, whoever was here from Ireland at the time moved back and just kept lips sealed on the whole thing. So that's the only way they found out, is the same death date. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Yes, sir.
If I remember right, you titled the book
Ashes Underwater.
Why did you choose that?
So there's a few things. There are several. Oops, wrong person. The widow of Joseph Erickson, Florence, lived pretty long life into her 70s and died, and was always in love with Joseph Erickson, always her first husband. And when she died, she was cremated and they had her ashes spread to sea. That's one. The main thing, though, was that, remember I talked about how the Eastland would sort of tilt and tip. They, by and large, tried to avoid, there was an ash chute. Remember, again, from the Titanic movie, remember how the coalmen were down there and they're shoveling and putting up, that's exactly what was happening inside the Eastland, same thing. Coal-fired engine, steam engine. What they would do is they would shovel up ashes and put them through the chute that was just above the water line, just above the, so the waters, and it would drop onto the lake, and they had to get ash out of there because it piled up so quickly. They never wanted the ash chute to go underwater, because if it did, it would compromise the whole ship. Like, I have an opening and now water's pouring in. So you needed to keep the ashes above water. And in this case, the day it sank, the ashes were underwater. That's a great question and fun to talk about. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to talk to you. Carol, do you have any further announcements, or? Okay, so Carol mentioned that there are some books. If anyone has one that you'd like me to sign, I'd be happy to. I'm selling them for $25. I don't care if you buy it or not. I mean, it's so long as you read the story. But I will be available for a few more minutes if anybody's interested. So thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. They would say, yeah. But I just